Folks, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We're really excited about today's program. I'm Chris Neidl. I'm going to be your moderator and co-host today. I'm the co-founder of the Open Air Collective, which I'll give a little bit more information about towards the end of the session. Today, what we're going to talk about is the role of local governments in advancing carbon dioxide removal and how that role can be amplified and multiplied when local governments, cities, and communities do it together. So we're excited to talk about that idea and talk about it in very real terms. We have an announcement from the City of Flagstaff in Boulder County, which we'll hear from just shortly. But as we get into it, before I talk a little bit about the program over the next hour, I just want to set the stage. Carbon dioxide removal is a term that many people, even deeply immersed in climate practice, are maybe just getting familiar with right now. Carbon dioxide removal, there's been a lot of talk about it. I'm actually here at the climate conference in Glasgow, and it's been remarkable about how finally this concept and imperative is really surfaced. But we understand that there's still a lot of confusion or relatively low level awareness about it. What you're going to hear in depth from some of our guests today are discussion of a lot of the different science and policy aspects of carbon dioxide removal. But just at a very high level, what are we talking about here? What aren't we talking about? So CDR really describes, as it kind of sounds, activities that take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it somewhere, whether it's in geological structures, in biological material, in oceans, or even in products. So that's what we mean by carbon dioxide removal. And as folks in the climate community on every level, which I know that is a lot of folks in our audience come from, are obviously familiar with thinking about climate action in terms of these essential and well-established domains of reducing emissions as fast as we possibly can by defossilizing our economy, and also adapting to inevitable changes that are already going to happen based on how much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere. So adaptation. So carbon removal is a third front in the climate emergency. It's not a substitution for either of these. It's another thing that we now have to do in addition to these two other domains as rapidly as possible. Those of you who have been following this in recent years, this has become all the more clear. This is what the science is telling us in the most recent UN IPCC assessment. It's clear that any pathway that's going to limit us really to a safe temperature rise, 1.5 C, requires carbon dioxide removal. So again, it's not an elective thing. It's not a substitute. It's something that we now have to do, and we have to do it fast. Now, the question, when you think about such a massive problem, what's not often talked about is, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, what is the role of local governments, of communities, of cities, towns, and counties? Is there a role? And at Open Air, and I know that my fellow panelists today all agree, not only is there a role for local governments, we don't think it actually is going to happen without them. So there's a huge role where local governments have obviously been ahead of the curve, particularly in North America, on taking climate action seriously from the front lines. We think that same leadership translates and must translate into carbon dioxide removal. So today, what I'm really excited about, you're going to hear from two fantastic leaders. Susie Strife, who's the Director of Sustainability, Climate Action, and Resilience in Boulder, Colorado. And she's joined by Ramon, Alatorre, who's the Climate and Energy Coordinator for the City of Flagstaff, Arizona. These two are going to tell you a little bit about what their vision is. Why do they think that this is important? And particularly together in coalition, what is it that the Flagstaff, Boulder, and countless cities all over the West, North America, and the world can do to take a lead and push carbon dioxide removal forward? We're also joined by an excellent panel where we have experts in the scientific community. We have Stephanie Arcusa, who's an environmental scientist, postdoctoral research fellow at Arizona State University, and Jane Zelikova, who's a research scientist and advisor for Carbon Direct, which is a leading carbon dioxide removal consultancy, are going to fill in some of the blanks around the science and the practice of carbon dioxide removal. And we're thrilled to have Boulder's own Representative Tracey Bernett joining us from the 12th District, who's also going to talk about her thoughts. So she'll join us for the discussion. So we're going to go ahead and get started. The program that we have today is, first, we're going to start with Dr. Arcusa, is going to kind of give us a high level of the why, what, and when of carbon dioxide removal for those of us who are new to the subject. Then we're going to hear from both Ramon and Susie in order. Are going to talk about their vision for a role for local government in driving progress in carbon dioxide removal. And then Dr. Zelikova is going to talk a little bit about the standards and quality around carbon dioxide removal. In other words, how do we know that we're actually doing carbon dioxide removal right, which is a critical information for local governments to have as they progress or proceed with carbon dioxide removal initiatives. And then we're going to have a discussion. We're going to go ahead and talk with the panelists, go into some depth on some things that were raised during the presentations. And that'll include you. And what we're going to do, we have a pretty big audience. I know we had well over 130 RSVPs for today's event. So I'm going to ask folks to submit their questions through the Q&A, which is on the bottom of your Zoom panel, rather than in the chat, just to keep that uncluttered. I'm going to be adding other resources as we go in the chat that I think will be helpful that you can read or watch later. As we're going, some of our panelists like Dr. Zelikova and Dr. Arcusa can go ahead and answer them. So feel free to go ahead and ask those questions as they occur to you during the presentation, and we'll go ahead and try to answer them by text, and then we'll take some of those into our discussion as well. So thrilled to get started, and I'm thrilled to get started with Dr. Arcusa. She's at one of the leading centers, the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions at Arizona State University, right in the thick of the carbon dioxide removal science and policy. So we couldn't have a better person that's going to give us a high level right now and walk us through the why, what, and when of CDR. So Stephanie, let me know if you can hear and if you're ready to go.
Perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me to present on the physical science basis of carbon dioxide removal. So as mentioned, my expertise is in climate science, and I focus on carbon sequestration and verification standards. So according to the scientific community, the Earth is now warmer than in the past 125,000 years. And it is virtually certain that human activities are causing this change. Most of the world is experiencing the impacts of climate change, from extreme heat to larger wildfires to more intense droughts and floods. Some of these changes have been happening for decades in the developing world, but are only starting to hurt now in the developed world in recent years. To try to limit further damage, the world agreed to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, with stark warning from the scientific community of impacts even at 1.5 degrees Celsius. The reality, though, is that we will cross the 1.5 degrees Celsius sometime soon, maybe in the next 2 decades, 2 degrees Celsius very likely after that, and we are heading for well over 2 degrees Celsius if efforts currently and climate policies are not ramped up. Why is this happening? We can start by imagining the atmosphere is like a bathtub with a partially opened drain. The tap represents man-made emissions of greenhouse gases. And here we can focus on CO2, which is the main greenhouse gas and is produced by burning fossil fuels. The drain represents the natural removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere by the biosphere, the oceans, and by geological processes. And each are working to remove CO2 at different speeds. So plants and the ocean work on timescales of decades to millennia, while geological processes work on timescales of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. And because the drain is so slow compared to the flow from the tap, leaving the tap running will increase the water level in the tub. So over the past 150 years, we have continued to open the tap, emitting greenhouse gases at rates much faster than can be drained naturally. The result is an increasing level of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and in turn, this is causing rising temperatures. The good news is that over the past decade, it seems that we have stopped opening the tap. The bad news is that the tap is still flowing, as we are still producing emissions, and the drain is still too slow. So the level of CO2 continues to rise. For the level to stop rising, we have two choices. Either emissions go to zero, or the inflow must equal the outflow, and this is known as net zero. The added challenge is that we have delayed climate action for so long that even if we reach net zero or zero emissions sometime soon, the level of CO2 will be too high. The associated rise in temperature will cause damages to ecosystems that we depend on to support us, like coral reefs and the Arctic sea ice, and increase risks such as flooding. We will need to adapt, but we also will need to reduce the level of CO2 in the atmosphere to bring it back to a safer level. In a net zero concept, This would mean making the outflow from the drain larger than the inflow from the tap. In other words, we will need to reach negative emissions where human-made removals are larger than human-made emissions. So the question now becomes, how do we get to net zero emissions and reduce the level of CO2? For decades, the message has been that we need to reduce emissions, and this is still the priority. The added message of today is that reducing emissions is not enough. We will need to also remove. How much we will need to remove will depend on how successful we are at reducing emissions. From a technological point of view, 70 to 80% of emissions are considered quote unquote easily reduced compared to the last 20%, which are called hard to abate, from sectors such as aviation, shipping, and from the production of structural materials. However, as Flagstaff and Boulder County and many others are finding out, even the easy reductions are difficult socially and politically, as it requires transforming our entire way of life. So to handle the consequences of these difficulties and to reach net zero or zero emission goal, to limit further damages of climate change, I will now introduce some of the tools on hand when it comes to removing emissions. In discussions of climate action, you will hear many acronyms, and it's very easy to get discouraged and think they are all the same, but the differences really do matter. So to be clear about what we are talking about today, I would like to go through 3 different acronyms that you will hear in discussions. The first is CCS, or carbon capture and storage. This generally refers to technology that is used to prevent CO2 from escaping a power plant. The CO2 is then compressed and injected into geological formations. CCS enables existing infrastructure to continue and has been around for decades, but by itself does not remove emissions. Then there is CCU, or carbon capture and utilization, which usually refers to capturing CO2 from the air and using the CO2 to make valuable but short-lasting products, such as beverages and fuels. With CCU, the CO2 ultimately returns to the air, and this practice will have an important role to play to move society to a circular carbon economy, because it uses non-fossil CO2 instead of fossil CO2. There are many forms of CCU that overlaps with CDR, such as concrete, for example, and CDR stands for carbon dioxide removal. This is a practice which refers to capturing CO2 from the environment and storing it somewhere in a reservoir to prevent it from returning to the atmosphere. When it is done right, CDR can deliver emission removals, whereas CCU and CCS do not. In most instances, the CO2 will be stored in a reservoir that has no direct use. So for example, a geological formation. Whereas in other instances, CO2 can be stored in useful but long-lasting products, such as construction materials like concrete and non-fossil plastics. CDR is always a 2-step practice. First, carbon is captured by technology or by a natural process or by some kind of practice. Then it is stored in a carbon reservoir. And many different combinations exist on a spectrum from nature-based to engineered, with some hybrids in between. So for one example of a more nature-based CDR is the planting and nursing of trees, so that as the trees grow, they capture and store carbon. Another example that is more engineering-based is capturing carbon from the air using direct air capture, compressing the CO2 as a gas and injecting into geological formations or rocks like basalt to form carbonates. All these types of CDR are just not made equal. And when designing or supporting CDR projects, it is important to think along several dimensions and to think about how these dimensions overlap. The main dimensions are listed on the slide here. So we need to think about the reservoir durability and reversal risks. So how long can carbon be stored and how vulnerable it is to being released? We can think about reservoir durability, reservoir reversal risks. So that's how long carbon can be stored and how vulnerable it is to being released. And this is a dimension that matters because when we consider the long-term requirements of using CDR for climate action, then we need to think about the costs and the required investments to remove a ton of carbon, as well as the long-term maintenance and monitoring. We also need to consider the maturity of the CDR type in terms of deployment, in terms of our knowledge of the consequences, and in terms of the protocols to measure and verify the carbon has been stored. And then we also need to think about the benefits and side effects, asking for whom, for what, and on what scale. And finally, when looking at projects, we need to think about the social and environmental justice considerations and ask if the decisions follow a democratic process. And later you will hear from Jane from Carbon Direct about how they are developing guidelines and best practices to navigate all of these dimensions. And finally, to wrap up, the challenge is to navigate all of the dimensions I just mentioned so that removals can be ramped up at scale quickly, but responsibly and with quality. Pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius are the ones in blue in the figure. And when they limit the overshoot, they imply that we will need to reach 10 gigatons of removal per year by the year 2050 and 10 to 20 gigatons removal per year by 2100. And for context, we emit every year about 40 gigatons, and we have emitted over 2,400 gigatons of carbon over the past 150 years. So this decade is really crucial. It is the decade for testing, for deploying, not only to bring the cost down, but to really find out if CDR will work and help us achieve our goals. But for now, I will turn to Ramon and to Susie, who will describe how Flagstaff and Boulder County are beginning their journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arcusa. My name is Ramon Alatorre. I am the Climate and Energy Coordinator at the City of Flagstaff in Arizona, which is in the United States. And I am going to pick up on that question of what this all means for local governments and what our role can be, because as Chris said, we would contend that cities and other local governments are critical to the development and deployment of carbon removal projects and strategies, and that the necessary speed and scale might not happen without local governments on the leading edge of framing and action. Local governments are far more nimble than their national counterparts. And as a result, many local governments have been able to mobilize relatively quickly to set goals that are ahead of their national governments. We know that almost all national pledges are inadequate to stabilize climate and limit warming to 1.5 degrees right now. And in response, many communities, including Flagstaff, that find this reality unacceptable are demanding that their local officials set targets that are compatible, and then work to make a plan and identify the necessary resources to execute on it. In this way, local communities and local governments that represent them are working to create the tide that is necessary to sweep up other entities and to pull along their national governments. We in Flagstaff like to say that the US federal government probably didn't announce their 50 to 52% reduction goal in April because of Flagstaff specifically, but they did so because of cities and local governments like Flagstaff and Boulder County collectively. So what actions can local governments take to advance carbon removal initiatives and otherwise create the tide? First, there is the need to start incorporating carbon dioxide removal into our narratives as a key element of any serious climate response. This can be done by including CDR in our climate action plans, or discussing CDR when talking to our constituents or advising our electeds. Indeed, one thing local governments can do is to simply have the courage to start talking about CDR. Because just as seeds won't sprout without light, CDR projects and opportunities and collaborations won't emerge unless CDR becomes part of the climate conversation, similar to renewable energy and electric vehicles. Currently, the narrative on CDR among local governments is not fertile ground for growing. Often, the generous framing is that CDR might be an insurance policy. More often, it is simply ignored, unspoken, or placed in the category of someone else's responsibility. However, many of our communities have looked at the science that was presented here by Dr. Arcusa, and they have recognized that the global deadline to arrive at net zero emissions is sometime around mid-century, and that climate stabilization will require decades of net negative emissions at gigaton scale. And so they have demanded that their local governments pursue carbon neutrality on pre-mid-century timelines, fully aware that this goal and these timelines will require pursuing the simultaneous and parallel pathways of emissions reductions and carbon removal at scale in this decade. Our communities are demanding that we pursue CDR because they know that it is necessary, though it is not sufficient, that it must be a both and conversation, not a zero-sum conversation. Indeed, our communities are already telling us that they are firm in their stance that investments in carbon removal do not give license to any diversion of resources from emissions reductions efforts. And this shift in narrative does take some courage. Many of the entrenched narratives are rooted in the obstacles that CDR faces, ranging from the technical and economic to the environmental, historical, social, and political. Indeed, the following statement from the 2018 IPCC document Summary for Policymakers bears repeating that unless affordable and environmentally and socially acceptable CDR becomes feasible and available at scale well before 2050, pathways to 1.5 degrees will become difficult to realize. The technical and economic obstacles are relatively clear, and local governments will need to be prepared to engage on these considerations. But the environmental, historical, social, and political considerations are also prevalent. Indeed, communities and local governments will have to get comfortable acknowledging the uncomfortable history of various negative emissions initiatives over the past handful of decades. Specifically, the so-called practice of purchasing offsets is riddled with a flawed history that we do not have time to unpack in this presentation. And so communities and local governments will have to be able to acknowledge that history on one hand and find a way to move forward productively with carbon dioxide removal on the other, learning from the shortcomings of the past and implementing practices to address them going forward. This brings us to the final point on the slide. By getting involved in CDR initiatives, local governments have the opportunity to provide leadership on the development and adoption of the most robust principles and the highest possible standards when it comes to project approach, measurement, verification, etc. If local governments stay on the sideline, then they will have little influence on the standards that are adopted in this space. The flow chart on this slide comes from the 2020 paper, The Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting. The aim of this paper and chart is to be an open source resource to provide communities and policymakers with a framework to effectuate meaningful carbon removal and drawdown. When looking at the bottom of the chart, the quality of the initiative is considered in terms of whether the measure is considered a reduction or a removal, its level of permanence and risk of reversal, and will ultimately require a robust measurement and verification. This resource could be a good starting place for local communities looking to start having these conversations about the way forward. It is one example of a resource that acknowledges historical shortcomings and a tool to address them. Later on, Susie from Boulder and Jane from Carbon Direct will also talk about the work they have been doing to develop standards and resources that can be shared with other communities. This standards-based work is also the specialty of Dr. Arcusa, who previously presented. And indeed, this example of sharing resources and striving towards standards and protocols that are replicable and can be easily adopted by other communities is perhaps the first benefit to highlight when considering how local governments can work together to advance carbon dioxide removal, because it would be inefficient for every local government to develop their own standards from whole cloth. And the effort to do so might be the barrier that keeps many communities on the sidelines. A relevant analogy might be how, for the most part, local governments don't write their own building codes from scratch. Flagstaff, for example, looks to the International Energy Conservation Code, which puts out a comprehensive model code every 3 years. In 2019, Flagstaff adopted the 2018 IECC codes and elected to include a few optional additions. Similarly, by working together on standards, local governments can dramatically reduce the bandwidth required of their staffs. So, what might a local government coalition and approach to carbon dioxide removal look like? The solar and wind industries might actually provide some viable frameworks that many local governments are already familiar with. One of the mental hurdles that many local governments experience is the sense that all CDR initiatives look like billion-dollar air capture facilities located close to geologic sequestration sites. And that can feel completely inaccessible, especially for smaller communities like Flagstaff or those without a viable sequestration resource nearby. So one strategy that solar and wind have developed to overcome similar obstacles is the practice of power purchase agreements, or PPAs. PPAs have allowed communities to aggregate their demand with participants committing to purchasing 10 or more years of solar or wind at predetermined rates, which then allows developers to go ahead and build that large-scale renewable energy facility in a central location where the solar or wind resource is viable. This is one form that a local government coalition for CDR could take. Imagine if 10 or 20 or more communities came together to make 10-year purchasing commitments. This aggregated demand could allow a large centralized project to be sited where the sequestration resource is viable, and communities could purchase removals at utility scale prices. Another framework that a local government coalition might consider would be to apply the solarize or solar co-op model. Rather than aggregating demand for a centralized project, solarize campaigns bring together dozens, if not hundreds of people and businesses that are interested in smaller distributed projects, typically solar panels located on their own roof. By coming together and awarding the entire portfolio of projects to the winning bidder, each member of the group tends to get a significant discount compared to what they would have received on their own, and the developer secures a large portfolio of contracts in one fell swoop, saving them significant client acquisition costs. It's a real win-win for everyone. This is another form that local government coalition for CDR could take. Indeed, the more conversations that we are having with experts in the CDR space, the more apparent it is that there are smaller scale approaches that could be deployed in a distributed, community-sided fashion. Imagine again, if a dozen communities came together, determined a project approach of mutual interest, and then put out a request for proposals to award the winning bidder 12 contracts in 12 communities, all in one fell swoop. The purpose of this slide is to show that local governments have been a significant contributor to the total solar procurements of the past decades, as well as the critical need for early investment and deployment-led innovation. While solar has begun to experience the so-called hockey stick upward swing of deployment capacity in recent years, this only became possible following decades of investments from early adopters, including local governments. Many CDR innovations will likely follow similar growth models. Knowing that we will need multi-gigaton scaled CDR in 20 to 30 years, we must then begin to develop deployment-led investments and innovation now. We will not be able to simply flip a switch. This type of exponential growth requires early stage resources that go beyond the laboratory. Local governments helped spur deployment for solar, and they can do the same for carbon removal. Since 2015, we see that municipalities have installed over 12,400 megawatts of capacity. This represents at least 14% of the total solar capacity installed over that time. At the same time, the cost of solar has come down significantly. The same has been observed in countless other industries, from DNA sequencing to hard drives to batteries. Investments in deployment-led innovation support steep cost curve reductions. And we know that many will point to the federal tax credits and incentives and not local governments as the action that moved the market for solar and wind. However, this clearly shows that local governments have played a key role in leveraging federal incentives and turning them into projects. Carbon removal may well follow a similar playbook. Indeed, the 45Q tax credit has been in effect since 2008 and was updated in 2018. Unlike the ITC and PTC, however, few if any local governments have figured out how to leverage 45Q. The federal government may well take the lead on some carbon removal projects. They will also likely look to states and local governments to leverage funds and develop projects, which means that local governments will need to start getting up to speed, sharing resources, and otherwise finding ways to collaborate in order to do just that. Now, I will hand the presentation over to Susie Strife from Boulder County.
Thanks, Ramon. So stimulating the market is really only one way that local governments can play a role in advancing this space. We can also support and adopt progressive local and state policies, which is a key lever to help transform the market. For example, with leadership from our own Representative Tracey Bernett, Colorado recently passed the Buy Clean Colorado Act, which encourages manufacturers to use low carbon building materials. New York also adopted the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act, which is another great model. And there's a more holistic approach in the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act, which is a fantastic policy that could really initiate CDR market development and one that we are advocating for in Colorado. A benefit to all of this is the potential to create a carbon drawdown workforce, whether through nature-based solutions or technological approaches. Here in Boulder County, we're starting to ask questions like, how do we provide our farmers with a market incentive to start or continue regeneration practices that draw down carbon and provide valuable co-benefits for our community? How can this coalition, as Ramon just articulated, pool resources to support common CDR projects which have shared beneficial outcomes? Can we invest in a climate workforce to protect and manage the health of our existing urban forests and value the living carbon in our communities as essential for climate stabilization? And finally, and most importantly, what can we do with carbon revenues that helps the communities who are disproportionately burdened by the impact of the climate crisis? But let me be clear, there are challenges engaging with the right carbon removal technologies, strategies, and providers. Local governments will need guidance in developing, reviewing, and selecting proposals and clear methodologies for evaluating these projects. In many ways, a lot of us in this field of work are the first responders to the climate crisis in our communities. And we are now facing the increased burden of resourcing the preparation for and response to climate change impacts. As a consequence, resources will need to be used in ways that demonstrate the intersectional benefits between carbon drawdown and our emission reduction objectives and climate resilience imperatives. So communities like ours will want to spend their resources on localized, place-based, or charismatic projects, and we will need help sourcing and developing high-quality opportunities. To overcome these challenges, we are co-creating resources for communities in partnership with the Open Air Collective and Carbon Direct. For example, we have already drafted a resolution that can serve as a template for local governments to pledge support for CDR as a necessary strategy within a comprehensive climate action plan. We will also soon develop an evaluation and decision-making framework through which local governments can pursue place-based carbon removal. This set of resources will include guiding principles for what constitutes a high-quality carbon removal offset project, which will help inform resource allocation decisions at the local level. Given the dynamic nature of this field, we will need to evolve and form best practices together. And we are so fortunate to leverage the collective wisdom of experts who are defining this emerging space. We are a constellation of more than 3,000 local governments across the US who want to have a meaningful impact on the climate crisis. By acting in unison through a coalition, we could yield collective power and create impact at scale. And we really welcome you to join and help shape this effort. Now I'll hand it over to Dr. Jane Zelikova to further discuss the foundational work that Carbon Direct is undertaking in this space.
Thank you, Susie. So a little bit about Carbon Direct. Carbon Direct is a company that is tasked with scaling the carbon management capacity. And they do this by both investing in innovative carbon removal companies that are actually trying to scale these solutions and build kind of a business case for carbon removal, and also providing world-class scientific advising to their clients, which include companies and governments who are trying to build a pipeline for really high quality carbon removal credits. So folks that are trying to meet their climate goals and achieve net zero get advising from Carbon Direct advisors, which I'm a part of the team. So that's a little bit about Carbon Direct. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that we have noticed working in this space over the last few years is that there is a growing market for carbon offsets and carbon removal credits. But one thing that you'll note, and this is from an article in Bloomberg, is that most of the offsets on the market today are actually not removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The majority of offsets are still in renewable energy and avoided or changing forest management, deforestation and forest management, some in energy efficiency, and very few are actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Another thing to note is that this market is growing leaps and bounds, doubling in terms of volume traded over the last 2 years. And projections show that this market is going to be huge over the next decade, as more and more companies and governments are making bold climate statements and goals and setting goals that will require carbon removal and carbon offsetting. And so the way that Carbon Direct approaches thinking about what a carbon removal credit looks like that is actually quality is we think about these 5 criteria. The first is we think about additionality and setting a really good baseline. So for a carbon credit, what we need to see is that the removals would not have occurred if there hadn't been a carbon removal payment made, and that setting a baseline relative to which carbon removals will be tracked over time has to be done conservatively so that we don't risk overcrediting and actually kind of diminishing the carbon and climate benefits. So additionality means there's financial additionality, so you wouldn't have been able to do the project if they hadn't received a carbon payment. There are all other kinds of additionality that are applied to nature-based solutions that have to do with how the land is being used relative to what is proposed. The other really major part of this is that the carbon accounting has to be really rigorous, because for every carbon credit that is purchased, there's a carbon ton that is emitted somewhere else. So we need those numbers to really match up and be very rigorously measured. And so for carbon accounting, what we really are looking for is projects that are quantifying and monitoring carbon removals using really rigorous and verifiable methodologies. And that they are also estimating their uncertainty and being able to subtract that from the carbon accounting to issue the right number of credits. The next big thing, and this is really important, is that we are looking for projects that don't do additional harm. We can kind of envision that you could have a carbon removal project that is doing great on carbon removal and sequestration, but is actually causing additional environmental or climate harm. And so we do a do no harm risk assessment, where we look at impacts on surrounding ecosystems, but also on communities. And we're looking at projects that not only do no harm, but also deliver positive co-benefits to their communities and to their ecosystems. The next thing we're looking for is that the carbon that is removed is done so in a durable way, so that the carbon is stored in a way that has a really low risk of being re-released back into the atmosphere, whether that is through involuntary or preventable activities. So projects usually state how long they think the carbon will be stored, and we look for their durability claims and check the scientific literature to make sure that those durability claims are feasible, that the carbon that is stored is actually feasibly stored for the amount of time the project claims. And lastly, we look at leakage. And what leakage means is really that the activities that the project is going to undertake are not displacing activities elsewhere that would cause emissions. So one example is that if you prevent deforestation in one area, the deforestation will take place somewhere else. And so the overall impact is null because of this idea of leakage. So deforestation taking place elsewhere outside of where we're accounting and monitoring the carbon. So these are the aspects of carbon removal crediting that we look for when we look for quality carbon removal projects.
All right, great. Thank you so much, speakers. That was phenomenal. There's a lot to get in here. If I could have the panel go ahead and join me and turn on your cameras, that would be fantastic. A lot to unpack there. I think I'm going to tag on a few more minutes probably to the program so that we can get questions in. But what I wanted to do to begin with is that we're really lucky to be joined by Representative Tracey Bernett, representing part of Boulder. As Susie mentioned, hasn't been in the body very long, but wasted no time in getting some really high impact legislation and laws passed. And we've been having some really great conversations with her about carbon dioxide removal. So to start off the discussion here, I'm wondering, Representative Bernett, if there's any impressions or ideas that you wanted to share, or even questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for this this meeting, and I'm just really excited about this. I've known for a long time that we're beyond the point of taking the go slow approach to addressing the climate crisis. We're living in a climate crisis right now, and it's only going to get worse unless we do all of the above. It's not only eliminating the sources of greenhouse gas emissions and building in resilience, but I was so delighted when we started having this conversation about removing carbon out of the atmosphere. I've been very interested in learning more about this subject. And of course, through all of this, we need to keep environmental justice and equity in mind. And so I've been learning about the many different technologies and strategies that we can do to implement. And I know there's a lot more on the way. And to me, it just takes education and setting up the framework and setting up the incentives for really bringing this forward. I am still learning about CER, but here's the way I look at it. Colorado was a leader and has been a leader in addressing the climate crisis for a number of years, especially this last year. And when I was elected last year, what I really wanted to focus on were the really hard to decarbonize sectors. And so, and the ones that are going to take the longest to do, like the building sector, the built environment, and industrial processes. These are some of the things I addressed in my Buy Clean Colorado bill, as well as a bill that improved the energy efficiency of home heating and transitioning to clean heat technologies. But I've been focusing since in this last 6 months or so on sequestration, especially in the ag sector. And so I'd look at the work that we've done so far in Colorado has really been recognized by many states and the federal government. A lot of times change happens at the local level and at the state level, and that really spurs other states and the federal government to take notice and follow suit. So I look at this as another area, this whole idea of carbon removal, CDR, is another area where Colorado can really take the lead.
Right. Well, we like that you're the first that we know of state elected officials to really be jumping into this complicated subject, which we just scratched the surface of. So we really want to express our gratitude for your interest in it and look forward to continuing the conversation. But I wanted to, we have some good questions that have come in here from our audience, but I wanted to go ahead and just kind of delve into a couple of the things that were raised. I think that one of the things that Susie, obviously you drove home really powerfully, as did you, Ramon, is that coalitions are required here. We can really amplify and multiply our impact here if we work together. And I loved, Ramon, the parallels to solar that you brought in. That was fantastic. But this is also not a new thing. This is something that is already sort of part of what local governments do. They collaborate quite extensively. So Susie or Ramon, I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit if there's other sort of precedents in collaboration in the climate space that we might be able to point to as inspiration or direction for what we're trying to do here.
Sure, I can get started. I'll invite Susie to weigh in as well. In Flagstaff, we have actually helped facilitate one of those solarized style campaigns. And we did so in collaboration with Sedona, the city of Sedona, which is pretty close to Flagstaff, as well as Coconino County, which is the county that we are sort of within. And so that was it was an opportunity of a project that we initiated, and then we were able to really just kind of amplify and magnify the impact because we started being able to bring in other governments and make it available to more folks. And it really did follow that same kind of solarized campaign. We had over 200 people sign up, and they were able to get a pretty significant discount on the solar that was on their roof. But I was actually talking with Nicole Antonopoulos, who's the director of sustainability at the city, and she was telling me about the work that's been done at the Western Adaptation Alliance, or the WA, over the last a little bit more than a decade. And the WA is comprised of a lot of intermountain states. I know Salt Lake City and Fort Collins and Tucson and some others are involved in that. And starting in 2008, some of the projects that they were able to effectuate included pooling resources so that they could have some real robust like GIS analysis done of the whole region. It was one of those cases where, just like Flagstaff's budget would not have been enough to be able to get a GIS sort of company to do some work for our region, but by pooling all of the resources, we got the whole region mapped in terms of some of the catastrophic climate events that were happening, and they were able to associate costs with that and begin to sort of build the case for taking proactive action rather than reactive action because of the actual cost of responding to all of these climate emergencies. So that was an interesting case of aggregated and pooled resources that resulted in a project that otherwise may never have come to fruition.
Thanks, Ramon. I do. I thank you for that, Ramon. Those are great examples. And one example that I have put in the chat that I use as inspiration for this coalition is that Boulder County and the City of Boulder in 2015 started a coalition of local governments across the state of Colorado called Communities for Climate Action, or CC4CA. And that now represents 40 local governments across the state advocating for stronger state and federal climate policy. So we basically pool resources to fund one central organization that represents all of us at the legislature to bring a unified voice on climate policy. And so we've had tremendous impact and outcomes due to this collective approach. And it's proportionate to your population, what you're paying in those due memberships fees. So that's one example. Another really exciting example is a group of organizations, including the Urban Drawdown Initiative, the Trust for Public Land, and American Forest. They are now working on aggregating an entire portfolio of urban forest projects across the US. And this could result in bundled sales of carbon credits in urban forestry projects. And so this is known right now as the city forest credits, and they're actually nearing the completion of the first bundled offset sale at $30 a ton. So that would be totaling 1.2 million. And these projects are really designed to have the co-benefits associated with them. So water infiltration, shade, all the great things, pollution prevention that trees provide our local communities. So that's a really exciting model of pooling resources for this type of effort.
That's great. One question I wanted to ask, we can start with Jane, actually. You know, what Flagstaff and Boulder County are doing here is they're talking about their own focus on this and proposing a coalition. But the good news is, as well, is there are other local governments here in North America and more broadly that are also looking at CDR. So these could be potential collaborators in a coalition like this. I didn't know if there was any particular examples, and this could be for Jane or anyone on the call, where we're seeing other local governments do interesting work or starting to do interesting work in the CDR space.
I can give a quick example of our neighbor to the south. New Mexico is working on looking for CDR opportunities in the land management space. So thinking about especially the grazing lands and forest lands and how to manage those lands to store more carbon underground, and also generate potential carbon credits for the landowners and for the state, which is also a large landowner. So that's an example of a local sort of action that is kind of in the local carbon shed for New Mexico and the municipalities especially, and a way to potentially do climate action at a very local level.
That's great. I think Representative Bernett, in our conversations before, I know you were really interested in, obviously, what are the assets that Colorado can leverage? And I think that is what we have to think about with CDR. It's not just about these generic one-size-fits-all types of solutions that are going to populate diverse landscapes. It's about discovering and growing and innovating based on what we have in local places, which is one of the reasons why a local government approach is the best, because they have visibility on those opportunities in ways I think that other types of levels of government don't. So let me ask another question that might be, unless anybody has to add to that, you might have some other projects in other cities, Susie or Ramon, that you're fond of.
Just one, I just want to call out the city of Oakland really was also at the forefront of incorporating CDR into their climate action planning. I don't know what's come to fruition, but I really hope that they become a part of our coalition. That's
great. Yeah, I've been doing some research. There's a lot of stuff I think that's starting to take shape. And one of the things that we want to do from the Open Air Collective, we're a network of activists that are increasingly all over the world. And our goal will be to try to, train, recruit activists to try to bring people into the coalition wherever they may be. So that's exciting, something we can look forward to. One of the other questions that was raised in the Q&A here was just about trying to characterize what are the sort of the policy developments that we're seeing more broadly globally on any level. Here in Glasgow, there's a lot of talk about it. There was an interesting announcement from the Department of Energy, Secretary Granholm, about the federal carbon negative shot. So that'll be the government funding research and development to try to bring down the cost of CDR. But Jane or anyone else on the call, I didn't know if there was any other sort of policy best practices on any level that we could maybe point to right now that are starting to drive us in the right direction.
There's a lot happening in across the USDA, both in climate smart agriculture and forestry spaces, since the USDA manages both in terms of trying to set up rigorous standards for how we account for carbon in agricultural and forestry systems, seeking feedback and comments from the general public about these programs, and then potentially and we can have a much longer conversation about this, but managing or weighing in on a carbon market that farmers and ranchers would be able to access if they're sequestering carbon in their soils. So the USDA is certainly developing a suite of policies, expanding programs that help sort of incentivize practices that sequester carbon in soils and better kind of forest management more generally. So that's an agency we should be looking to for some leadership.
Great. Well, we have just a little bit more time, and I thank the panelists who've been answering a lot of the questions that have been coming in real time here. I think what we could do now is talk about next steps. I mean, such excellent presentations. I mean, you look here who we have here. We have such an amazing scientific community, as well as in the Western states where Stephanie is representing. We have real leaders in Ramon and Susie and their teams respectively, and Representative Bernett. And then what I thought was really, compelling is that we have a very refined, sophisticated way of thinking about good CDR versus bad CDR, which Jane really helped give us some information, and the expertise of Jane will be at our disposal as local governments as we move forward with this. Jane, was there anything you wanted to add? I know that we had a sort of a short window of time for your presentation, but certainly if there's a lot of nuance there, but if you think there's some essential points that you want to add before we break, we could please do elaborate.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions about offsets. So I think maybe one thing that's really important to note is that there's kind of a difference between just your run-of-the-mill offset, and the majority of the market is flooded with these kinds of offsets where someone is balancing their carbon budget, just like you might be balancing your financial budget at home. And for every carbon ton that you're emitting, you're purchasing someone else's claiming of reducing a ton of carbon. And in an offset framework, the best we can do is stay at neutral, right? Carbon emitted here, carbon reduced here, we're staying at neutral. What's different about carbon removal credits is that the carbon is actually removed from the atmosphere for some amount of time, and that's why durability really matters. And so it's worth differentiating carbon removals from sort of other kinds of offsets. And that isn't something that is done very well on the market today, but that is something that a lot of people are interested in moving forward and developing really rigorous standards around, because carbon removals are not the same as offsets. So I think it's just really important to note that, and that as local governments are thinking about meeting their climate goals, I think it's going to have to be a combination. And we should always say, like, reducing emissions is the number one thing we have to do. We have to do it immediately, drastically, and we don't stop until our emissions are as close to zero as we can get them. But in meeting a local government sort of climate goals, reducing emissions has to be coupled with sort of investments in removals, because over time there will be some emissions that we cannot reduce to zero. There are some industries, like if you are a municipality that includes steel or cement factories, you're not going to be able to reduce those to zero. There aren't currently renewable energy sources that can replace fossil fuel sources. So in that case, developing carbon removal capacity is really important, and differentiating between a regular offset and a carbon removal credit is also important.
Right. So I think that was a very succinct and complete and accessible answer, but I think in the answering of it, we realize how much there is to know there and how we have to really navigate through this. So we're really glad to have you on the call and part of this conversation. So we have just a couple minutes left that I want to talk about next steps, because that's the key piece here. I think you could pick up from Ramon and Susie. I just thought it was such excellent presentations, but this is an invitation to join a coalition. So it's a coalition of two now. We know there's other local governments and cities around the country and the world that we want to be connecting with that are already looking at CDR. But if you represent a local government, or you're an activist in your particular community, or you're interested in getting involved, the power of this will be amplified by the more we add. And it's not just a volume thing, it's a diversity thing. The more types of places and people we have involved, the more creative and impactful we're going to become. So what I want to do is just, as we close, talk through a couple of just some next steps that we have coming up. So the very first thing that we're going to do is, this is a recorded session. So we'd like to ask folks who are interested in this to go ahead and share the video. So we're going to send, sorry about this. We're going to send an email out tomorrow, which will include the links that I discussed, and we're also going to share the video. So step number one, please share this video so we can start to grow the network. We also have on Monday, November 15th, another event. And Susie, could I just call on you real quick to give us a little bit of information about that event? But it's going to be starting to dig down. It's a learning call about carbon dioxide removal. So Susie, I don't know if you want to give a little bit of detail on that.
Sure, you bet. So this is a Urban Sustainability Directors Network, USDN, and UDI Urban Drawdown Initiative co-hosted event on carbon drawdown learning. And this is sort of the second one that Ramon and I have been involved in. It's an hour and a half starting at noon And we're going to have breakout sessions to learn more about what sort of a group procurement model could look like. And we also have invited an expert on direct air capture to join us as well. So we really hope that you can join us in getting into the weeds a bit on what we can do to initiate this coalition and have some impact.
Great. And the invitation for that, the Zoom invite, is going to be sent out in the email that I just referred to. So you can go ahead and register for that. And then the last part is, what do we do now as a coalition? Susie also mentioned that the formulation of principles has already started. They're great. I've read them. And there's work that's already starting with the folks who have talked today. But now we want to expand the circle here and get good ideas and leadership from more far afield. And so in early December, we're working through a few details on this. We're going to start that process of having conversations and starting to formulate what a coalition would look like and what its priorities would be. We want to get going right now. So we're going to start very, very soon. And you're on our list. There might be some more details in the email tomorrow, but we will certainly be reaching out when we're ready to initiate that. But I just want to thank everyone who participated in this, both the audience and our amazing speakers. I thought it was a wonderful laying out of potential. And we hope that folks who joined us tonight in the audience will join the coalition and help make local governments and communities incredibly relevant in the conversation and action around carbon dioxide removal. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.